Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Kicking off this week with a couple of mentions of new patrons John Kadesh and Dag Atler-Nesheim. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Dag. As with all of you who have become patrons, if I have somehow omitted to give you a mention and you'd like one, or you've heard yourself mentioned but incorrectly pronounced, then do get in touch and I will be happy to put that right. As ever, if you want to find out about our Patreon campaign, just pop along to patreon.com/The History Network. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 27, Episode 3, Pontiac's Wars. This episode was written by Doug Nipple. As any regulars of you will know, Doug has written for us before, and he is a high school physics teacher who lives a few miles outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Growing up in one of the major areas of early American history, it was only a matter of time before he became obsessively interested in it. Thanks for the script, Doug. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, ending the 7 Years' War. The victorious British moved west into the Ohio Valley of North America and occupied the forts and outposts of the defeated French. New and drastic policies were instituted on the native tribes inhabiting the area. Those tribes rose up and attacked the British and displaced colonists from the territory. This began a summer of conflict between the native tribes, the American colonists, and British military. The new policies driving the natives' actions were a result of a new British Governor-General in command of North America, Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst drastically changed the policy of trade and negotiation with Native Americans. He had a low opinion of the Native Americans and believed they had no recourse but to accept the fact that the English would cut back on gifts to the tribes, especially muskets and ammunition. The French traded with the natives as equals, but the British treated them more like slaves or indentured servants. This change in policy was a last straw in a collection of slights and abuse from the British. A tribal chief named Pontiac was one of those most vocal in calling for a change through violence, an uprising to remove the British from their lands. There are not many confirmed facts concerning Pontiac's early life. Most historians seem to agree on his heritage as part Chippewa and part Ottawa, and his birthplace as a village outside of Fort Detroit near the modern-day city of the same name. There are many legends and tales of Pontiac's involvement in many of the major conflicts of the 7 Years' War. There are claims that he was a tribal leader at Braddock's defeat on the Monongahela in 1755, and that he had led the Ottawa tribe at the massacre of the surrendered British forces at Fort William Henry on Lake George in 1757. There is no concrete evidence for these claims, but he must have been a respected leader by the time of the French defeat in the war and the change of British policy. In 1762, Pontiac was sending out representatives to stoke the fires of dissension and to plan attacks on the British forts and outposts in the area. By the spring of 1763, enough tribes had loosely joined together that coordinated attacks on the British began throughout the Great Lakes area. On May 1st, 1763, Pontiac and a large group of warriors entered Fort Detroit to supposedly meet with the commander and perform a ceremonial dance as a sign of friendship and goodwill. In reality, it was a ruse to map the fort's defences and gather intelligence. Fort Detroit had a contingent of approximately 150 soldiers commanded by Major Gladwin, a multi-year veteran of the North American campaigns, who had been around long enough to sense that something was amiss. After his reconnaissance of the fort, Pontiac spent the next several days planning to attack the fort by again using the excuse of meeting with the commander and performing ceremonial friendship dances to gain entry to the fort with a larger group and attack the unsuspecting garrison from within the walls. During that time, word got to the fort, and Gladwin knew about the plan in advance, so that when Pontiac arrived at the fort, he found the entire garrison at arms on the parade ground. Gladwin still welcomed Pontiac, but Pontiac knew that his plot was discovered, and withdrew. He returned the next day to try and explain to Gladwin that the previous day's situation wasn't ill-intended, and that he would return again tomorrow with all of his warriors to pay respect. Again, Gladwin rightfully had his doubts, and his command fully armed when Pontiac returned. Pontiac again retired without implementing an attack. Not to be deterred, the next day he returned on the Detroit River with over 50 canoes of warriors, thinking he could successfully breach the fort through the river access. By this time, though, Gladwin had the fort on lockdown, and the water attack failed to gain entry. Pontiac changed strategy and decided to siege the fort and attack all of the settlers and homesteaders in the area. By the end of July, a British relief force of over 20 large river barges, called bateaux, with almost 300 soldiers, commanded by Captain Dalyell, had moved up the Detroit River and into Fort Detroit. Like Gladwin, Dalyell was a veteran on the North American campaigns of the French Indian War, but unlike Gladwin, he was a close confidant and aide to Governor-General Amherst, and used this fact and his ambition to advocate an immediate offensive against Pontiac's camp. Not blinded by ambition, Gladwin recognised this as a hazardous action, especially since the newly reinforced fort could now easily wait out the remainder of the summer, and the natives would have to break the siege at that time to hunt and prepare for winter. Eventually, Gladwin reluctantly agreed to Dalyell's plan for an attack due to the latter's connections with Amherst. Early on July 31st, in what would later become known as the Battle of Bloody Run, Dalyell led most of his contingent of men out of the fort and along the river toward Pontiac's camp. Pontiac had the fort under observation, so he received word of this excursion immediately and was able to set up an ambush with his 400 warriors. He split his warriors in half and sent one half to circle back around Dalyell's column to cut off their retreat back to the fort, forming a U-shaped ambush around the trail back to the fort. The other half he concealed in front of a small wooden bridge over a stream. Once Dalyell's column was mid-crossing, the natives fired volleys into the troops that had already crossed the bridge and forced them back across the stream. As detachments of the column fell back under heavy fire, they entered into the opening of the U ambush. A quick-thinking detachment of British Rangers was able to secure a nearby farmhouse and stabilise the position with fire from the sheltered location. Dalyell decided to retreat back to the fort instead of continuing the fight. Personally leading the attack to reopen the road back to Fort Detroit, he succeeded in the breakout as the survivors of the column were able to retreat to the fort, but it cost him his life. British losses were 20 dead and 40 wounded. Pontiac's losses are not known, but estimated to be only a few dead and wounded. Pontiac had won the Battle of Bloody Run, but the fort was resupplied and defended by even more troops, as a few days after the battle another British ship arrived with more supplies and a fresh contingent of over 50 troops. Where Pontiac ultimately did not have success in his siege on Fort Detroit, other groups in his loose confederation did have victory after victory, capturing almost all of the British forts and garrisons in the Great Lakes area early in the summer of 1763. Some of these were truly small outposts, with rosters with as few as 10 soldiers. Most were captured quickly through deceptive strategies rather than prolonged sieges. Fort Sandusky on Lake Erie near modern-day Sandusky and Fort St. Joseph on the border of Ohio and Michigan were both captured in May. Both forts were really just small blockhouses with garrisons of around 15 soldiers. Troops were lured out under the pretense of councils, ambushed and killed. Both of the commanding officers were allowed to live and eventually were ransomed. Fort Miami, located in Michigan, also fell at the end of May. One story of the fort's fall relates that the commandant of the fort had a local native woman as a mistress who was used to lure him out of the fort, where he was shot and the fort captured. Several other forts were captured during the time. The last fort to fall was Fort Michilimackinac, located at the northern tip of the lower Michigan Peninsula on Lake Michigan. It was manned with a large garrison of 35. At the beginning of June, the inhabitants of the fort had no idea that all of the other forts around them had fallen, and thought nothing was amiss, as a large group of natives were playing an early version of lacrosse outside the open fort gates. One of the warriors lobbed the game ball over the fort wall, and the others followed him into the gate after it. As they entered the fort to supposedly continue to play after the errant ball, a group of females who had been watching the game by the gates tossed hidden weapons to the warriors as they entered the fort. They massacred the unsuspecting British garrison. As the violence spread over the frontier, word came back to Fort Pitt, the large British fort at the site of present-day Pittsburgh, that the natives were attacking outposts throughout the area and moving east. Settlers in the countryside made their way to the fort for safety from an anticipated attack. In May, small groups of natives began to raid the surrounding farms and settlements, and eventually in June this fort came under siege. It was the largest British outpost to the west, with around 250 soldiers and about the same amount of civilians now packed inside the fort. At the end of July, when word finally reached the east coast of the Fort Pitt siege, Colonel Bouquet was assigned and led a group of about 250 troops from Philadelphia to relieve the siege. At the beginning of August, they were at Fort Ligonier, about 50 miles from Fort Pitt. Bouquet decided to create a fast-moving column of troops to relieve the fort and have the rest of the supplies follow in wagons at a slower pace. The natives laying siege to the fort received word that a relief column was approaching and temporarily lifted the siege to move towards the approaching British column and attack them before they could arrive at the fort. The natives set up an ambush on the hills before Bushy Run. What followed was a 2-day battle, the Battle of Bushy Run, with Bouquet defeating the natives in a hard-won fight. 2 days later he arrived at Fort Pitt, lifting the siege. As the summer of 1763 turned into fall, Pontiac's siege on Detroit faded as his warriors left to begin preparations for the harsh Great Lakes winter. Though successful on a series of smaller British forts, he and his chiefs had failed to take the largest British outposts before the onset of winter and the ending of hostilities for the year. As the year ended, the Governor-General, Geoffrey Amherst, was recalled to England, and a new administration under Thomas Gage planned a 2-front response to the violence. Expeditions to the Detroit area under Colonel Bradstreet and into the Ohio Valley under Bouquet were planned for 1764. These were not hastily gathered relief columns, but extremely large columns of 1,500 men to each area. The influx of these new troops brought peace to the area by threat of the sword. Later, Bouquet would write Gage that the hostilities of the summer of 1763 could have been avoided by the presentation of a few gifts to the natives and a little diplomatic tact. Looking forward, he recognised that this was the beginning of the end of Pontiac and his people, as encroachment on their lands would continue with the inevitable westward expansion of the colonists. Pontiac met his end in 1769 after moving further west and living in the Illinois area. Most historians agree he was killed by a warrior from another tribe. The widely accepted story is that his murder was a reprisal for Pontiac's earlier killing of the chief of another tribe. Well, thanks again, Doug, for sending us that script on Pontiac's wars. If you would like to submit a script or have an idea for one that you'd like to work on with us, then do drop us a line. info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And remember, there's our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/The History Network. We really do appreciate each and every one of you who has become a patron of the podcast. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Doug Nipple, read by Nick Barker.